The lawyer handed me keys to a property everyone in town crossed the street to avoid. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button real quick. Tomorrow, I'm sharing a story that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about family secrets. I was 18 years old, 3 weeks out of Maplewood Group Home, when a letter arrived at the Youth Services office with my name on it. Mrs. Richardson, my caseworker, had forwarded it to the tiny studio apartment I'd managed to rent with my first paycheck from the diner where I worked double shifts just to make rent. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, expensive-looking. The return address showed a law firm I'd never heard of, Patterson and Associates, from a town called Millbrook, about 60 miles north. My hand shook as I opened it, half expecting another bill or some bureaucratic reminder that I was on my own now. Inside was a letter from an attorney named Gerald Patterson. He wrote that a man named Thomas Whitfield had passed away 2 months earlier and had left specific instructions in his will regarding me. I read that line 3 times. Thomas Whitfield. The name meant absolutely nothing to me. According to the letter, Thomas had left me property, a farm to be exact, 43 acres with a main house, a barn, and what the letter described as various outbuildings in states of disrepair. There was also a small amount of money, about $8,000, set aside specifically for property taxes and initial repairs. I sat on my second-hand couch, staring at the letter until the words blurred. I'd grown up in the system since I was 5, after my mother died of an overdose. I had no family, no connections, no history beyond a series of foster homes and group facilities. Who was Thomas Whitfield, and why had he left me a farm? The letter instructed me to contact Mr. Patterson's office at my earliest convenience to discuss the details of the inheritance. I called the next morning during my break at the diner, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear the receptionist's greeting. Mr. Patterson had a kind voice, gentle and patient, as he explained that Thomas Whitfield had been very specific about his wishes. The old man had made arrangements for the property to transfer to me upon his death, with instructions that couldn't be discussed over the phone. "Can you come to Millbrook?" he asked. "There are documents you need to sign, and frankly, there are some things about this situation that need to be explained in person." I arranged to have the following Saturday off and took 2 buses to reach Millbrook, a small town that seemed frozen somewhere in the 1950s. Main Street had a post office, a general store, a diner that looked identical to the one where I worked, and Mr. Patterson's office above the old bank building. The attorney was in his 60s, with silver hair and reading glasses that hung on a chain around his neck. He welcomed me into his office, which smelled like old books and lemon furniture polish, and gestured for me to sit in a leather chair across from his massive oak desk. "Miss Emma," he began, and I noticed he seemed nervous, which immediately put me on edge. "Before we discuss the legal aspects of your inheritance, I need to tell you about Thomas Whitfield and why the circumstances of this bequest are somewhat unusual." He pulled out a thick file and opened it carefully. Inside were photographs, documents, and what looked like newspaper clippings. Thomas was a recluse, Mr. Patterson explained. He lived alone on the Whitfield farm for over 40 years, rarely coming into town, keeping to himself. The property has a difficult history in this community. Back in 1973, there was a fire. Thomas's wife, Margaret, and their infant daughter died in that fire. The official investigation ruled it accidental, but Thomas never recovered from the loss. He became convinced that he'd failed to protect them, and he withdrew from society entirely. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why are you telling me this? Because you need to understand why people in Millbrook avoid that property, he said softly. There have been stories over the years, rumors of strange occurrences, lights in the windows when the house should be empty, sounds coming from the barn. Most people believe Thomas's grief made the place cursed somehow. It's superstition, of course, but it's affected the property's value and reputation. He pulled out a photograph and slid it across the desk. It showed a younger Thomas, maybe in his 30s, standing next to a pretty woman with dark hair. She was holding a baby wrapped in a yellow blanket. They were standing in front of a white farmhouse with a red barn visible in the background. This was taken about 6 months before the fire, Mr. Patterson said. Thomas gave this to me when he drafted his will 3 years ago. He wanted you to have it. I picked up the photograph, studying the faces. The woman had a kind smile, but there was something about her eyes, something familiar that I couldn't quite place. I don't understand, I said. Why me? I never knew this man. Mr. Patterson took a deep breath. Thomas spent the last years of his life searching for something. Someone, actually. He hired private investigators, searched through state records, tracked down leads across multiple counties. About 4 years ago, he found what he was looking for. He found you. My throat went dry. What do you mean he found me? The baby who died in the fire, Mr. Patterson said slowly, wasn't Thomas's biological daughter. She was the child his wife was fostering. Their own daughter, their biological child, had been born 2 years earlier. Margaret had given the baby up for adoption because they were struggling financially and she was dealing with severe postpartum depression. It broke Thomas when he found out years later, but Margaret had died by then, and he had no way to find the child. They'd given up. The room seemed to tilt. Are you saying your birth certificate lists your mother as unknown? Mr. Patterson continued, pulling out another document. You were abandoned at Mercy Hospital when you were 3 days old. But Thomas's investigators found medical records that matched your birth date, your blood type, and your mother's identity. Margaret Whitfield was your biological mother. Thomas was your father. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what he was telling me. He wanted to contact you, Mr. Patterson said, his voice thick with emotion. Wanted to bring you to the farm, to explain everything. But he was terrified. Terrified that you'd hate him for giving you up. Terrified that you'd reject him the way he felt he'd rejected you. So instead, he watched from a distance. He knew where you were, followed your progress through the system, and made sure that when he died, you'd have something, a home, a place to belong, a way to understand where you came from. Tears streamed down my face. I had a father who'd known about me, who'd cared about me, who'd left me everything he had, and I'd never gotten to meet him. There's a letter, Mr. Patterson said gently, handing me a sealed envelope with my name written in shaky handwriting. He wrote it 6 months before he died. He wanted you to read it when you claimed the property. I took the envelope with trembling hands, but couldn't open it yet. I wasn't ready. The farm is legally yours, Mr. Patterson explained, returning to business as I tried to compose myself. But I need to warn you that it's been empty for 2 months, and honestly, it wasn't in great condition even when Thomas was alive. The main house is structurally sound, but it needs work. The barn is the real problem. Thomas became obsessed with it after the fire, spending all his time out there building something. Nobody knows exactly what, because he never let anyone inside. What do you mean, building something? The barn was completely rebuilt after the fire. Thomas spent years working on it, turning it into something more than just a barn. He'd go out there every day, sometimes staying until 3 or 4 in the morning. The few neighbors who were close enough to see the property say they'd see lights moving around inside, hear the sound of hammering and sawing at all hours. But he never explained what he was doing, and he never invited anyone to see. That image sent another chill through me. A grieving man spending decades alone in a barn, building something in the darkness while the town whispered about ghosts and curses. "I know this is overwhelming," Mr. Patterson said. "You don't have to decide anything today. Take the keys, visit the property if you want to, and think about what you'd like to do. The inheritance is yours, regardless of whether you keep the farm or sell it." But even as he spoke, I knew I wasn't going to sell it. This was my father's home, my mother's home. It was the only connection I had to the people who'd created me, even if they'd given me up. I needed to see it, needed to understand what Thomas had spent 40 years building in that barn. I signed the legal documents in a daze, barely registering what Mr. Patterson explained about taxes and utilities. He handed me a set of keys on a worn leather keychain and a manila folder containing all the property documents and Thomas's letter. "One more thing," he said as I stood to leave. "Be careful out there. The property is isolated, and as I mentioned, the locals have their superstitions. If you decide to stay, you might find that people in town aren't exactly welcoming." I thanked him and walked out into the afternoon sunshine, clutching the keys so tightly they left marks on my palm. The farm was about 5 miles outside of town, down a winding country road that turned from asphalt to gravel to dirt as I got closer. I'd borrowed a car from a girl at work, promising to return it by Monday, and now I drove slowly, taking in the landscape as it changed from open fields to dense woods. Then I saw it. A weathered wooden sign barely visible through the overgrown bushes. Whitfield Farm, established 1892. The driveway was almost completely hidden, reclaimed by nature. Branches scraped against the car as I drove through, and more than once I thought I'd have to turn back. But then the trees opened up, and there it was. The farmhouse was exactly as it had appeared in the photograph, white clapboard with a wraparound porch, though the paint was peeling and several shutters hung crooked. Behind it stood the barn, massive and dark red, its size almost overwhelming compared to the modest house. And, beyond that, fields stretched toward distant tree lines, wild and overgrown, but somehow beautiful in their abandonment. I parked and sat for a moment, taking it all in. The silence was absolute. No traffic sounds, no neighbors, nothing but wind moving through tall grass and the distant call of a crow. This was mine, all of it. I got out of the car and approached the house slowly, half expecting someone to appear and tell me this was all a mistake. The porch steps creaked under my weight, and I had to test each one carefully before trusting it to hold me. The front door was locked, and when I inserted the key, it turned with surprising ease, like someone had oiled it recently. The interior was dim, dusty, frozen in time. Furniture sat exactly where Thomas must have left it months ago. A worn recliner faced a small television. The kitchen had a table set for one, with a plate, a cup, and silverware laid out like he'd been expecting to return for dinner. The refrigerator was empty and unplugged, but the cabinets still held canned goods and dry pasta. I walked through the rooms slowly, touching nothing, just observing. Upstairs, there were 3 bedrooms. The largest had a bed stripped to the mattress and a dresser covered in dust. The second bedroom was completely empty except for a single rocking chair facing the window that looked out toward the barn. But it was the third bedroom that stopped me cold. It was painted a soft yellow, and though it was dusty like everything else, it had clearly been decorated as a nursery. A crib stood in one corner, a changing table in another, and the walls were covered with hand-painted clouds and stars. A mobile of fabric birds hung above the crib, motionless in the still air. This had been prepared for me, for the baby Margaret and Thomas had given up. They'd made me a room, had planned for me, had wanted me, and then something had happened, something that had torn that dream apart. I left the house and walked toward the barn, my heart pounding harder with each step. The building was huge, at least twice the size of the house, with tall double doors secured by a heavy padlock. I tried several keys before finding the right one, and when the lock finally clicked open, I hesitated. What comes next is something I never saw coming. Stick with me and make sure you subscribe. I pulled the doors open, and they swung wide with a long, low groan. Sunlight flooded into the interior, illuminating something that took my breath away. The barn had been completely transformed. The entire space had been converted into a workshop and living area combined. But it wasn't just a workshop. It was a museum, a shrine, a 40-year project of love and grief and hope. Every wall was covered with photographs, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all carefully mounted and labeled. They showed Margaret's life from childhood through her teenage years, her wedding to Thomas, her pregnancy. There were photos of the nursery being prepared, of Thomas painting clouds on yellow walls, of Margaret smiling and holding her stomach. And then there were photos of me, not taken by Thomas, but collected somehow. School pictures from every grade, candid shots that must have been obtained from social workers or foster parents, images of me growing up while Thomas watched from a distance. Each one was labeled with the date and a small note in his handwriting. Emma's first day of second grade. Emma at age 12, school play. Emma, age 16, working at summer camp. He'd tracked my entire life, had known where I was, what I looked like, what I was doing, and he'd never once reached out. The workshop area took up half the barn and was meticulously organized. Tools hung on pegboards, lumber was stacked by type and size, and a massive workbench stretched along one wall. But it was what sat in the center of the space that made me start crying. It was a house, a dollhouse, but calling it that felt wrong because of its size and intricacy. It stood about 4 feet tall and 6 feet wide, a perfect miniature replica of the farmhouse outside. Every detail was exact. The wraparound porch, the peeling paint, the crooked shutters, even tiny rocking chairs on the porch, and inside, visible through windows that actually opened, were fully furnished rooms. The yellow nursery with its clouds and stars, the kitchen with its table set for one, the bedroom with the rocking chair facing a tiny version of the barn. Next to the dollhouse was another structure, a miniature of the barn itself, and inside it was another tiny dollhouse, creating a recursive loop that made me dizzy to contemplate. But what broke me completely was what sat in front of the dollhouse, a small wooden bench, child-sized, with my name carved into the seat. Next to it was a note in a sealed plastic bag to protect it from moisture. I picked up the note with shaking hands and read Thomas's final message to me. "My dear Emma," it began, "if you're reading this, then you've found what I spent 40 years building. This barn became my sanctuary after the fire took your mother and the child we were fostering. I couldn't save them, and I couldn't find you. So I built this instead, a place where I could keep you safe, even if it was only in my imagination. Every night I would come out here and work on the dollhouse, creating the life I wished we could have had together. I made you a room, made you a place at our table, made you a home even though you were living in homes that weren't yours. I know it's not the same as being there for you. I know I failed you by giving you up and then being too much of a coward to find you sooner. By the time I finally hired investigators and located you, you were already 16, already almost grown, already shaped by a life I hadn't been part of. I convinced myself it was too late. That showing up would only hurt you more. But I couldn't let you go into the world with nothing. This farm, this barn, this ridiculous dollhouse that consumed decades of my life, it's all yours now. It's not an apology, because nothing can apologize for abandoning your child. It's not an explanation, because there's no good explanation for cowardice. It's just what I have, what I built while I thought about you every single day. The dollhouse is more than it appears. Inside the miniature barn, there's a false floor in the workshop area. Lift it, and you'll find one more thing I saved for you. Your mother's letters. She wrote them during her pregnancy and the weeks after you were born, before the depression got too bad and before we made the terrible decision to give you up. She loved you. We both did. We just couldn't see a way to keep you and give you the life you deserved. I hope you can forgive us. I hope you can forgive me, and I hope this place, strange as it is, can become something good in your life. You come from people who loved you, even if we didn't know how to show it properly. Your father, Thomas." I sat on the tiny bench holding the letter and cried harder than I'd ever cried in my life. Not just for what I'd lost, but for what Thomas had lost too. 40 years spent alone, building miniature rooms for a daughter who never came home, watching from a distance as I grew up without him. I opened the miniature barn's door and found the false floor Thomas had mentioned. Underneath was a metal box, and inside were letters, dozens of them, all written in a flowing script that must have been Margaret's. I read them one by one as the afternoon light faded. They told the story of a young woman who'd gotten pregnant at 22, married quickly, struggled with finances, and overwhelming anxiety. She wrote about feeling like she was drowning, unable to connect with the baby growing inside her. She wrote about the day I was born and how terrified she'd been when they placed me in her arms. "I don't feel what I'm supposed to feel," she wrote. "Everyone says you fall in love with your baby instantly, but I just feel scared. Scared I'll hurt her. Scared I'll fail her. Scared she deserves better than this broken version of me." The later letters were worse. Margaret described her depression getting deeper, described days when she couldn't get out of bed, couldn't feed me properly, couldn't function, and then the final letter written when I was 3 days old. Thomas and I made a decision today. We're going to leave her at the hospital where someone qualified can care for her, someone who won't feel this crushing fear every time she cries. I love her. I do. But love isn't enough when you're drowning. Maybe someday she'll understand. Maybe someday we can find her again when I'm better, when we're ready. But right now, giving her up is the only way to keep her safe. From me, from this darkness that won't let me go. I understood then. They hadn't given me up because they didn't want me. They'd given me up because Margaret was sick and they were terrified and they thought they were saving me. And then the fire had happened. Margaret had died, and Thomas had spent the rest of his life regretting a decision made out of desperate love. I spent that night in the barn, wrapped in an old quilt I found in a storage chest, surrounded by photographs of a life I'd never lived, and evidence of a man who'd never stopped being my father, even in absence. The barn didn't feel cursed or haunted. It felt like what it was, a shrine built by grief and love, a 40-year prayer that his daughter might someday come home. Over the next few weeks, I started making the farm livable. I used some of the $8,000 Thomas had left to hire contractors for essential repairs, fixing the roof, updating the wiring, replacing broken windows. The house slowly came back to life. The townspeople in Millbrook remained wary. When I went to the general store for supplies, conversations would stop when I entered. People would glance at me, then look away quickly. But I also started finding things left on my porch. Fresh bread, a basket of vegetables, a note that just said, "Welcome," with no signature. One morning, I found an elderly woman standing by my mailbox. She was tiny, maybe 4'10", with white hair and bright blue eyes that studied me carefully. "You look like Margaret," she said without introduction. "Same eyes, same way of standing. I'm Dorothy Brennan. I was your mother's best friend before she married Thomas." I invited her in for coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table while she told me stories about my mother. Real stories, not just the sanitized version in Thomas's notes. Margaret had been funny, artistic, and deeply anxious even before I was born. She'd painted those clouds in the nursery herself, had dreamed of becoming an art teacher, had struggled with expectations and her own complicated feelings about motherhood. "She loved you," Dorothy said firmly, but she was drowning in postpartum depression at a time when people didn't talk about it, didn't have treatments for it. She and Thomas made a choice they thought would save you. And then she died, believing she'd never see you again. Thomas spent the rest of his life trying to make up for that. "Everyone in town avoided him," I said. "The rumors, the stories about the barn." Dorothy smiled sadly. "People fear what they don't understand. Thomas wasn't haunting that barn with ghosts. He was haunting it with grief. But grief isn't dangerous, just heartbreaking. Some of us understood that. Some of us tried to help. But Thomas wouldn't let anyone in. He said the barn was the only place he could still talk to Margaret, still feel close to the daughter they'd lost. After Dorothy left, I went back to the barn and really looked at what Thomas had built. It wasn't just a dollhouse, it was a love letter. Every room he'd created, every tiny piece of furniture he'd carved, every detail he'd perfected, it was his way of keeping me close when the real world had separated us. I decided then that I wouldn't sell the farm. I'd stay. I'd turn the house into a home and figure out what to do with the barn. Maybe make it a workshop where I could create something of my own. Maybe turn it into a space where other people who'd lost family could come and feel less alone. I started renovating in earnest, learning carpentry from YouTube videos and making mistakes that would have made Thomas laugh. The yellow nursery became my bedroom, and I kept the clouds and stars on the walls because they felt like a connection to parents who'd tried their best, even when their best wasn't enough. 6 months after inheriting the farm, I held an open house. I invited the whole town, determined to change the story of the Whitfield property from something people avoided to something that welcomed them. I served food, gave tours, and explained who I was and why I'd come. And people came. Slowly at first, nervously, but they came. They walked through the house, admired the repairs, and listened as I told them about Thomas and Margaret and the complexity of love and loss. When I opened the barn doors and showed them what Thomas had built, more than one person cried. They saw it not as something creepy or obsessive, but as what it truly was, a father's 40-year attempt to be close to his daughter the only way he knew how. Dorothy stood beside me as the sun set and the last visitors left. "You've given Thomas something he never had," she said. "You've given him forgiveness." "I'm not sure he needs my forgiveness," I replied. "He did what he thought was right." "Maybe," Dorothy said. "But you being here, making this place alive again, letting people see the love behind the grief, that's a gift. You've turned his shrine into a home. That's what he always wanted." That night, I sat on the tiny bench in the barn one last time before moving it to the house. I held Thomas's letter and Margaret's letters and felt the weight of everything they'd tried to give me lifting slightly. I came from people who'd loved me even when love felt impossible, who'd made terrible choices out of desperate hope, who'd spent their lives regretting and building and watching and hoping I'd someday understand. And now I did. The abandoned farm everyone avoided had become mine, not just legally, but emotionally. It was where I learned that family is complicated, that love doesn't always look like we expect, and that sometimes the greatest gifts are the ones that take 40 years to build in the darkness of a barn while the world whispers about curses. I was home. Finally, completely home. Thank you so much for joining me on Emma's journey. If this story touched you, please subscribe to the channel. We share stories about unexpected families, hidden histories, and the complicated ways people love each other across distance and time. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever discovered something about your family that completely changed how you understood your past? What would you have done if you'd found Thomas's barn? And click on one of the 2 stories on your screen right now. Each one explores different aspects of finding where you truly belong. Until next time, remember that home isn't always where you start. Sometimes it's where you finally understand where you came from.